Okay, the next category I want to talk about is unprotected waters. Most marine plant biodiversity is outside of marine protected areas. Most large marine migrations are through unprotected waters. And even with dams and dredging, some wildlife can still use areas that are modified by people as long as they're relatively unpolluted. Um, so that involves a lot of different types of waters that can be used for conservation. Another category of unprotected land is land undesirable for people. This could be deserts, tundra, very steep mountains. They might not be protected, but they're not being economically developed by people, so they still can function, at least to some degree, for conservation. An example of this is the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Surprisingly, because nobody's been in there, certainly it's not 100% safe, but because there hasn't been regular human activity in this area, some populations have been able to recover. So an example is the vulnerable mountain goral, which is a little bit like a goat. And it also contains a third of the remaining endangered red-crowned cranes. And so these populations are actually doing fairly well in this most unlikely of conservation areas. Another very unlikely conservation area is Chernobyl, which is one of Europe's biggest unintentional wildlife reserves. Chernobyl is the site of a really bad nuclear reactor accident. And this shows, so we can see we're here, we've got Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. So this shows that area here, so Russia, Belarus, Ukraine. This is where Chernobyl is, and this is where the reactor is, and so you can see there is a 10-kilometer exclusion zone, and then in 1989 they put up a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, and this is the current exclusion zone they made even wider. And Kiev is south of here. And so obviously there were some initial severe impacts of the nuclear reactor accident on wildlife, but they moved all the people out of this very large area in Europe. And we know that Europe has a lot of people in it. So having this refuge for wildlife has been pretty helpful. And we've seen populations of wolves go way up. And populations of lots of other things too. There is a PBS Nature documentary all about the wildlife and the wolves in particular, inside this Chernobyl exclusion zone. I actually know two people that study wildlife inside this zone. I have a friend that's been studying frogs in this zone, and I've met somebody that studies the wolves there. And they're interested in the conservation value of Chernobyl, but they're also interested in research looking at cancer and how radiation, is there anything different about the physiology of some of these animals? They've found that the colors of animals that live in this area tend to be darker, and they think that that might have been an adaptation to dealing with this increased reactivity or radioactivity on a daily basis. But you can see here, this shows some monitoring of elk, which are the black bars, green are roe deer, and blue are wild boar, from the late 1980s through the mid 1990s, and you can see that the numbers have increased since before this accident occurred. So this shows some things that live inside Chernobyl. There are lynx, European bison, which are vulnerable, Przewalski's horse, which is endangered, and wolves. And so the name of this documentary is Radioactive Wolves. So something interesting you could potentially check out if you are inclined. The next category is private land. There are plenty of private estates in Europe, so wealthy people that own lots of land. Usually these were for hunting. Private hunting areas are a type of private land that has conservation value. In Europe, many old growth forests are actually protected by royal families, which is kind of an odd thing that we don't think about much in the United States, but those definitely have some conservation value. But backyards, which I've mentioned before, can have value as well. The National Wildlife Federation has a wildlife certification program, and the Louisiana Natural Areas nonprofit has a certification that you can have if you have a lot of native plants that you have grown in your backyard. You can have it certified as a native ecosystem. Homeowner associations sometimes own some natural areas, little pieces of forest or grassland or wetlands that can also have conservation value. So some private land is actually protected. So there's this kind of gray area between unprotected land and protected land that's private. And one way of doing this, and I'll want you to know this term, is a conservation easement. And this is when a private landowner agrees to donate or sell the rights to develop their own property. It is legally binding, and these persist after the property is sold. Usually in the agreement, a conservation organization has to sign on to it, saying that this land has conservation value, and this conservation organization is in charge of enforcing it. Sometimes there are tax benefits where perhaps you don't have to pay property taxes, or at least not as large property taxes, for the portion of the land that has the conservation easement on it. I mentioned previously about there's someone that has a shortleaf pine restoration site right outside of Ruston. He's been working really, really hard to maintain shortleaf pine forest, which is a endangered ecosystem in Louisiana and in fact globally. And he has an easement with the Nature Conservancy, and so that land is protected by this conservation easement. Another category is conservation in urban areas, which is something you don't think of. And it's certainly not the same as a national park or a national wildlife refuge, but there is some conservation value. Many species persist in urban, suburban, and public parks. It can be challenging, but it also provides educational opportunities. So I wanted to show two examples. This one's relatively easy. There's a lot of raptors that nest on the high buildings in cities. So this is a peregrine falcon nest in Chicago. And so this is frequent, and sometimes people will put up cameras so you can watch a live stream of the nest for some of these raptors. This is a really interesting example. This is Barton Springs in Austin, Texas. This is a very popular public swimming hole. You do have to pay a small fee to enter here, but this is a natural spring that's right in the center of Austin, Texas. And it keeps the water, I think it's 60 or 70 degrees year-round because it's coming from underground. So you can imagine in the very, very hot summers of Austin, this is a very popular place to go swimming because it's cool all the time. And I think it's open in the evenings for free. But there's a very, very endangered salamander that lives under these rocks in here. I don't know if you can see the changes in colors, but this endangered salamander lives under here, and then there's a couple other places where the spring comes out, like over here, and then there's another one way back here. And they've been working hard to make sure that public recreation and use of this area stays compatible with conserving this endangered species. And there's a little tiny museum all about the Barton Springs and the salamander that you can learn all about it. So a really good opportunity for education and outreach with this multi-use facility. Another one is agriculture. And we'll get to that in the next video.